Lyra didn't know that the man bidding on her from the shadows was the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories. She didn't know that he'd been searching for her his entire life, and she certainly didn't know that by the end of this night he would shatter every law in the kingdom just to claim her as his own. Standing on the auction block in her stepfather's borrowed servant dress, Lyra felt like nothing, less than nothing. The rough wooden platform beneath her bare feet might as well have been a grave marker, because the girl who'd once dreamed of love and freedom was already dead. What remained was just a debt to be paid, a burden to be sold. "Do I hear 50 gold pieces for this one?" The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowded hall, and Lyra flinched. 50 gold pieces. That's what her stepfather's gambling debts had reduced her to. 50 pieces of metal that would determine whether she spent the rest of her life scrubbing floors or warming some stranger's bed. The hall was packed with nobles in their finest silks and velvets, each one studying her like she was a horse at market. Their eyes crawled over her thin frame, her tangled brown hair, her calloused hands. She could practically hear their thoughts. Plain, unremarkable, barely worth the starting price. 50! Called out Lord Harwick, a cruel man with yellowed teeth who'd visited her stepfather's tavern more than once. His gaze made her skin crawl. 60! Another voice, this one belonging to a merchant with soft hands and a softer belly. At least he looked clean. The bidding continued, and Lyra tried to make herself smaller. She'd learned long ago that drawing attention only brought pain. Her stepfather had made sure of that. Every bruise, every harsh word, every night she'd gone to bed hungry had taught her the same lesson. She was worthless, and worthless things deserved whatever treatment they received. 75 gold pieces! Lord Harwick's voice was getting excited now, and Lyra's stomach churned. She'd heard the stories about his estate, about what happened to the girls who worked there. None of them ever came back to town. Something twisted in her chest, a desperate animal panic that made her want to run. But where could she go? Her stepfather had made it clear, if she didn't bring enough money to cover his debts, he'd sell her to the fighting pits instead. At least this way she might survive the night. "Do I hear 80?" the auctioneer called out. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Lord Harwick was grinning now, confident in his victory. He licked his lips, and Lyra had to swallow down bile. Then a voice cut through the silence like a blade through silk. 500 gold pieces. The entire hall went dead silent. 500. That was more than most nobles saw in a year. Lyra's head snapped up, searching the crowd for the source of the impossible bid. At the very back of the hall, barely visible in the shadows, between two marble columns, stood a figure that made something in her chest flutter like a trapped bird. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that caught the torchlight. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. Even from this distance she could see they were the colour of molten gold, burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through her soul. 500, the auctioneer stammered. "Did you say 500 gold pieces, sir?" The man stepped forward, just enough that the light caught the sharp angles of his face, the aristocratic line of his nose, the way his jaw was set with absolute determination. "I did." His voice was deep, commanding, with an edge of something wild that made the hair on Lyra's arms stand up. "And I'll pay double if anyone dares to bid against me." Lord Harwick's mouth fell open. The merchant took a step back. Even the auctioneer seemed afraid to speak. That is very well then. 500 gold pieces to the gentleman in the back." The gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent hall. "Sold!" Lyra's legs nearly gave out. 500 gold pieces. For her. It was impossible. It was more money than she'd ever imagined, more than her stepfather could have dreamed of getting for his debts. But why? What could this stranger possibly want with someone like her? The crowd began to disperse, nobles muttering among themselves as they filed out of the hall. But the man in the shadows didn't move. He just stood there, watching her with those impossible golden eyes, and Lyra felt something she couldn't name spreading through her chest like warm honey. It felt like recognition, like coming home to a place she'd never been. The auctioneer gestured for her to come down from the platform, his hands shaking slightly as he began preparing the paperwork. "The bill of sale will need to be—" "I'll handle the arrangements," the stranger said. And suddenly he was there, standing just a few feet away from the platform. Up close he was even more devastating, tall enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes, with a presence that seemed to fill the entire space around them. There was something about him that whispered of power, of authority, of secrets that could reshape the world. He extended one hand toward her, palm up, fingers long and elegant. "May I?" He was asking permission. This man who'd just spent a fortune on her, who technically owned her now according to the law, was asking for her permission to help her down from the platform. The simple courtesy was so unexpected that tears pricked at her eyes. Slowly, hardly daring to breathe, Lyra placed her small, work-roughened hand in his. The moment their skin touched, lightning shot up her arm. Not painful, but electric, alive, like touching the sun itself. Something golden and warm unfurled in her chest, a thread of light that seemed to connect her heart to his. Her breath caught, and she saw his eyes widen slightly, as if he felt it too. "What?" she whispered. "Easy," he murmured, his thumb brushing across her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it made her want to weep. "I've got you now. You're safe." Safe. When was the last time anyone had used that word about her? When was the last time she'd felt anything but fear? He helped her down from the platform with careful hands, as if she were made of spun glass instead of scars and sharp edges. Even when her feet touched the ground, he didn't let go of her hand. The golden thread between them seemed to pulse with every heartbeat, warm and steady and impossibly real. "The paperwork, sir," the auctioneer ventured nervously. The stranger's other hand moved to his coat, withdrawing a heavy leather purse that clinked with the weight of coins. "Keep the extra for your trouble," he said, setting it on the auctioneer's table without even counting it out. "And forget this transaction happened." The auctioneer's eyes went wide as he looked inside the purse. Whatever he saw there made him nod vigorously. "Of course, sir. Absolutely, sir. Transaction? What transaction?" Then they were walking toward the exit, her hand still clasped in his, and Lyra felt like she was floating. The golden thread in her chest pulled taut, singing with a music she didn't understand, but somehow recognized. With each step, the weight of her old life seemed to fall away, replaced by something bright and new and terrifyingly wonderful. At the threshold of the hall he paused and looked down at her. "What's your name?" "Lyra," she whispered. "Lyra Ashwood." Something shifted in his expression, a satisfaction so deep it looked almost like relief. "Lyra," he repeated, and her name had never sounded so beautiful. "My carriage is waiting outside. Are you ready to leave this place behind?" She looked back at the auction hall, at the platform where she'd stood like a piece of livestock, at the life that had never really been hers anyway. Then she looked up at this impossible man, with his golden eyes and gentle hands, at the future that stretched out before her like an unwritten story. "Yes," she said, and meant it with every fibre of her being. "I'm ready." As they stepped out into the moonlight together, Lyra didn't know what tomorrow would bring. She didn't know who this mysterious stranger really was, or why he'd paid such an impossible price for someone like her. But for the first time in her life, she felt the stirring of something that might have been hope. The carriage was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. Midnight black with silver inlays that caught the moonlight, pulled by 4 horses so magnificent they looked like they'd stepped from the pages of a fairy tale. The interior was all plush velvet and polished wood, with cushions softer than any bed she'd ever slept in. She perched on the edge of the seat, afraid to touch anything, afraid she might somehow break this perfect, impossible dream. He sat across from her, and in the intimate space of the carriage his presence was overwhelming. The golden thread in her chest hummed with awareness of him, pulling taut every time he moved, every time he breathed. She kept stealing glances at his profile in the flickering light from the carriage lamps, the strong line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, those devastating eyes that seemed to hold secrets older than time itself. "Where are we going?" she finally found the courage to ask. "Home," he said simply, but something in his voice made the words sound like a promise. They travelled through the night in comfortable silence, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats on cobblestone gradually giving way to the softer whisper of wheels on forest paths. Lyra must have dozed at some point, because when she opened her eyes, dawn was breaking over the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. A castle rose from the morning mist like something from a dream. Not the cold, forbidding fortress she might have expected, but something that seemed to grow from the very earth itself. Towers spiraled toward the sky, connected by graceful bridges and surrounded by gardens that even from this distance looked like they'd been tended by the gods themselves. Banners flew from the highest towers, deep blue silk with silver embroidery that caught the early light. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It will be your home now," he said, and something in his voice made her look at him sharply. There was an intensity in his golden gaze that took her breath away, a certainty that seemed to reach into her very soul. As they approached the main gates, Lyra noticed something that made her stomach flutter with nervousness. Guards, lots of them. They wore the same deep blue and silver as the banners, and every single one of them bowed as their carriage passed. Not a casual nod of respect, but deep, formal bows that spoke of absolute reverence. "Who are you?" she asked, though part of her was afraid to know the answer. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as if memorizing every detail. "Someone who has been waiting for you longer than you could possibly imagine." The carriage rolled to a stop in a courtyard paved with white stone that seemed to glow in the morning light. Fountains sang softly in the corners, and the air smelled of jasmine and something wild and clean that made her think of moonlight and freedom. He stepped out first, then turned to help her down. The moment his hands touched her waist, that golden warmth flared between them again, stronger than before. She gasped softly, and his grip tightened, steadying her. "I know it's overwhelming," he murmured, his voice low and intimate, "but you're safe here, I promise you that." More people were gathering now, servants in crisp uniforms, guards with their hands clasped respectfully behind their backs, even a few figures in rich clothing who looked like they might be nobles, and every single one of them was staring at her with a mixture of curiosity and something that looked almost like awe. "Your Majesty," one of the servants said, stepping forward with a deep bow. "Welcome home. Shall I prepare the rose sweet for your guest?" Lyra's blood turned to ice. "Your Majesty!" The words echoed in her mind, impossible and terrifying, and suddenly making everything else make sense. The guard's reverence, the magnificent castle, the way he carried himself with such absolute authority. She took a stumbling step backward, her hand flying to her throat. "Majesty." He sighed, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked almost vulnerable. "I was going to tell you. I was waiting for the right moment." "Tell me what?" But even as she asked, she already knew. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. "My name is Marcus Thornfield," he said quietly. "I am the Alpha King of the Northern Territories." The world tilted sideways. Lyra's knees buckled, and only his quick reflexes kept her from hitting the ground. The Alpha King, the most powerful shifter in the known world, the man whose very name was whispered with reverence and fear across the entire continent. And he had bought her, at an auction, like she was a piece of property. "I can't, this isn't—" She couldn't form coherent words. Her breath was coming too fast, her vision starting to blur at the edges. "I'm nobody. I'm less than nobody. I'm a tavern keeper's stepdaughter who got sold to pay gambling debts. Kings don't— You can't— Breathe, he said firmly, his hands cupping her face with infinite gentleness. Just breathe, Lyra. Look at me. She forced herself to meet his eyes, those impossible golden eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. The panic was still clawing at her chest, but something in his gaze anchored her, held her steady. I know this is frightening, he said softly. I know it seems impossible, but I need you to understand something. His thumbs brushed across her cheekbones, wiping away tears she didn't even realize had fallen. You are not nobody. You could never be nobody, not to me. You don't understand, she whispered. I scrub floors. I sleep in servants' quarters. I own one dress, and it's not even mine. You're a king, and I'm— You're mine, he said, and the word rang with such absolute certainty that it silenced every protest on her lips. The moment I saw you standing on that platform, the moment our eyes met, I knew. The bond between us, that golden thread you've been feeling, it's real, Lyra. It's the mating bond. It means you're my fated mate, my queen. Mate, queen. The words were impossible, too big for her to comprehend. She shook her head frantically. There has to be some mistake. The bond, or whatever this is, it must have gotten confused. I can't be— People like me don't become queens. People like you, he repeated, and there was something dangerous in his voice now. You mean brave people? Kind people? People who have survived things that would have broken others? People with enough strength to stand on an auction block with their head held high despite everything the world has done to them? I mean worthless people, she shot back, the word tearing from her throat like broken glass. Damaged people. People who don't deserve— He kissed her. It was soft, gentle, nothing like the rough claiming she might have expected. His lips moved against hers with reverent care, as if she were something precious beyond measure. The golden thread between them blazed to life, singing with a music that seemed to reach into every corner of her being. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself believe that this impossible thing might be real. When he pulled away, his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the space between them. You are not worthless, he said fiercely. You are not damaged. You are not broken. You are the other half of my soul, and I have been searching for you my entire life. I don't know how to be a queen, she whispered. Then I'll teach you, he said simply. I'll teach you everything. How to walk in silk gowns instead of borrowed dresses. How to command a room with nothing but your presence. How to rule with wisdom and compassion. But first, I need to teach you the most important lesson of all. What's that? His smile was soft, devastating, full of a tenderness that made her chest ache with longing. How to let yourself be loved. The watching crowd had tactfully dispersed while they talked, giving them privacy in the centre of the courtyard. But Lyra was intensely aware of the castle rising around them, of the magnitude of what he was offering. A crown, a kingdom, a love that seemed too good to be real. This is insane, she said, but there was less panic in her voice now. The golden thread between them pulsed with warmth, wrapping around her heart like a promise. Perhaps, Marcus agreed, but sometimes the most wonderful things in life are a little insane. He stepped back, giving her space to think, but his hand found hers, their fingers interlacing like they'd been made to fit together. I'm not asking you to decide everything right now. I'm just asking you to stay. Give us a chance. Give yourself a chance to see what we could be together. Lyra looked up at the castle, at the banners flying in the morning breeze, at the man whose very presence made something inside her feel like it was coming alive for the first time. It was terrifying. It was impossible. It went against everything she'd ever been taught about her place in the world. But that golden thread in her chest was singing now, bright and warm and full of possibility. 1 week, she heard herself say. I'll stay for 1 week. His smile could have lit up the entire kingdom. 1 week, he agreed. And Lyra? Yes? Welcome home. Lyra woke up in a bed that felt like sleeping on a cloud. The mattress was so soft she'd actually spent the first few minutes of consciousness convinced she was still dreaming. Silk sheets in the palest pink slid against her skin like water, and sunlight streamed through windows so large they could have housed entire families. But as consciousness fully returned, so did the crushing weight of reality. She was in the Rose Suite, a collection of rooms larger than the entire tavern she'd grown up in, decorated with more luxury than she'd seen in her entire life combined. And somewhere in this impossible castle was Marcus Thornfield, the Alpha King, the man who thought she could be his queen, the man whose kiss had set her soul on fire. She sat up quickly, pushing the memory away. She couldn't think about that kiss, about the way her entire world had narrowed down to the feel of his lips on hers, the way the golden thread had sung between them like a living thing. She couldn't think about how right it had felt, how perfect, because perfect things didn't happen to girls like her. The servant who'd brought her dinner the night before had laid out a simple day dress on the chair by the window. It was beautiful, soft blue wool with delicate embroidery at the cuffs, but it was still far too fine for someone like her. Lyra touched the fabric with reverent fingers, then pulled her hand away as if it had burned her. She needed to find the servants' quarters. That's where she belonged, not here among the silk and gold. Surely there was work she could do, some way to earn her keep that didn't involve pretending to be something she could never be. Opening the door as quietly as possible, she slipped out into the corridor. The castle was even more magnificent in the morning light. Tapestries covered the walls, depicting scenes of wolves racing through moonlit forests and warriors in gleaming armour. The floors were marble so polished she could see her reflection, and flowers in crystal vases filled the air with the scent of jasmine and roses. She made it exactly 3 steps before a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. "Going somewhere?" Marcus stood at the end of the hall, leaning casually against the wall, as if he'd been waiting for her. He was dressed more simply than she'd expected, dark trousers and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms. But even in ordinary clothes, he looked every inch the king he was. Power radiated from him like heat from a flame. "I was looking for the kitchens," she said quickly, "or the laundry, somewhere I could be useful." His expression softened. "You are useful, Lyra, just not in the way you're thinking." He pushed off from the wall and walked toward her, each step deliberate and graceful. "Have you eaten?" Her stomach chose that moment to growl loudly, betraying her. She'd been too nervous to eat much the night before, and now she was paying for it. "I'll take that as a no," he said, with a smile that made her heart do strange things in her chest. "Come, I'll show you the gardens while we have breakfast." "I can't eat with you," she protested. "You're a king. I should be serving you, not sitting at your table like an equal." He stopped directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his golden eyes. "Lyra," he said quietly, "you are my equal. In every way that matters, you are my equal. The sooner you understand that, the easier this will be." She wanted to argue, wanted to list all the reasons why a king and a tavern-keeper's stepdaughter could never be equals. But something in his gaze silenced her protests. There was such certainty there, such unwavering conviction, that for a moment she almost believed him. The gardens were breathtaking. Paths of crushed white stone wound between flower beds that looked like they'd been painted by an artist's hand. Roses climbed trellises that arched overhead, creating tunnels of pink and white and deep crimson. A stream ran through the centre of it all, feeding into pools where fish the colour of spun gold darted between lily pads. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached a secluded alcove where a table had been set with delicate china and silver that caught the morning light. The feast laid out there was enough to feed 12 people. Fresh bread that was still warm from the oven, honey that looked like liquid amber, fruit so perfect it seemed unreal. "Please," Marcus said, pulling out her chair, "sit." She hesitated, then perched on the very edge of the seat, as if she might need to flee at any moment. He sat across from her, but made no move to fill his plate. Instead, he just watched her with those devastating eyes. "I don't know how to do this," she said finally. "Eat breakfast. Be here. Be whatever you think I am." She gestured helplessly at the opulent spread, at the gardens, at him. "This whole world! I don't know how to be part of it." "Then let me tell you a secret," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Neither did I once." She looked up sharply. "You're a king. You were born to this." "I was born to it, yes, but that doesn't mean I was ready for it." His expression grew distant, shadowed with old pain. "I became king when I was barely 18. My father died in a hunting accident, and suddenly I was responsible for an entire kingdom. Hundreds of thousands of people looking to me for guidance, for protection, for answers I didn't have. That must have been terrifying." "It was. For the first year, I barely slept. I was convinced I was going to fail everyone, that I wasn't strong enough or wise enough to be what they needed." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the simple contact sending warmth spiraling up her arm. "Do you know what got me through it?" She shook her head, afraid to speak. "The knowledge that somewhere out there my mate was waiting for me. My other half, the person who would make me complete." His thumb traced across her knuckles, and the golden thread between them hummed with response. "I held on to that hope for 15 years, Lyra. 15 years of searching, of wondering if I'd ever find the one person who could truly understand me." "And you think that person is me?" The words came out as barely more than a whisper. "I don't think it. I know it." He lifted their joined hands and pressed a soft kiss to her fingertips. "The moment I saw you, something inside me that had been broken for my entire life suddenly felt whole." Tears pricked at her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her like this before, as if she were precious, as if she mattered. "But I'm nobody special. I don't have any talents or skills or—" "Tell me about your life before," he interrupted gently. "Your real life, not the one your stepfather forced on you. What did you dream about when you were a little girl?" The question caught her off guard. She couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked her about her dreams. I used to love books. Before my mother died, she would read to me every night. Stories about brave princesses and magical kingdoms and true love that could conquer anything." A sad smile tugged at her lips. "I used to dream about travelling to far-off places, meeting people from different lands, maybe helping them somehow." "And what happened to those dreams?" Her smile faded. "My stepfather said they were foolish, that someone like me needed to focus on practical things. He burned my books when I was 12, said they were filling my head with nonsense." Marcus's grip on her hand tightened, and for a moment she saw something dangerous flash in his eyes. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "He burned your books?" "It was a long time ago. That doesn't make it acceptable." The alpha in him was closer to the surface now. She could feel it in the way the air around them seemed to thicken. "No one should ever have treated you that way. You should have been cherished, protected, encouraged to reach for every dream you ever had." "Dreams don't put food on the table," she said, echoing her stepfather's words. "Dreams are what make life worth living," Marcus said fiercely. "And you, Lyra Ashwood, deserve to have every single one of your dreams come true." The conviction in his voice made something crack open in her chest, letting in a sliver of light she'd kept buried for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying hope. "I don't know how to let myself want things," she whispered. "Then we'll learn together." He released her hand and gestured to the feast before them. "Start small. What looks good to you?" It was such a simple question, but it felt monumental. When was the last time someone had asked her what she wanted instead of telling her what she needed to do? She looked over the spread, really looked, and found herself drawn to a plate of pastries that looked like they were dusted with stars. "Those," she said, pointing. His smile was brilliant. "Excellent choice. They're made with honey from our own hives and filled with cream that comes from the sweetest cows in the kingdom." He served her one of the pastries, then filled her plate with fruit and bread and things that made her mouth water just looking at them. And slowly, tentatively, she began to eat. It was the most delicious meal of her life. "Tell me something else about yourself," Marcus said as they ate. "Something good, something that your stepfather never could have taken away from you." She thought for a moment. "I'm good with animals. There was this stray cat that used to hang around the tavern, and everyone else just saw it as a pest. But I would save scraps for it, and eventually it started following me around. My stepfather said I was wasting food, but—" She shrugged. "I couldn't let it starve." "You have a kind heart," Marcus said softly. "That's not a small thing, Lyra. Kindness is one of the rarest and most precious qualities a person can possess. It's exactly the kind of trait that makes someone fit to be a queen." "You really believe that?" she asked. "That I could be that?" "I believe you could be anything you set your mind to. But more than that, I believe you already are everything you need to be. You just need to start believing it yourself." They finished breakfast as the sun climbed higher in the sky, and Lyra found herself relaxing despite her fears. Marcus was easy to talk to, patient with her hesitations, quick to laugh at her tentative jokes. The golden thread between them seemed to grow stronger with each passing moment, weaving them together in ways that felt both impossible and inevitable. "Would you like to see more of the castle?" he asked when they were done. "All right," she said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. He showed her libraries that could have housed entire cities, ballrooms with ceilings so high they seemed to touch the clouds, galleries filled with portraits of kings and queens from ages past. But it was the small things that caught her attention. The way he moved through the corridors as if he belonged there completely, the way servants smiled genuinely when they saw him, the obvious love and respect his people had for him. "They adore you," she observed as they walked through a corridor lined with windows that looked out over the kingdom below. "I hope so," he said simply. "A king is nothing without his people." "Is that why you've never married? Because you were waiting for your mate?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Partly, but also because I refused to marry for politics or convenience. I've seen too many loveless royal marriages, and I swore I would never subject myself or anyone else to that fate. I would rather rule alone than build a life without love." The simple honesty of it took her breath away. Here was a man who could have had anyone, who could have married for advantage or alliance, or a dozen other practical reasons. But he'd chosen to wait for real love, even if it meant waiting forever. "You risked everything," she said. "Your bloodline, your kingdom's stability. What if you'd never found me?" He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "But I did find you," he said, and the certainty in his voice made her knees weak. "I would have kept searching until my dying breath, because I knew you were out there somewhere. The bond doesn't lie, Lyra. You are my destiny, just as I am yours." She wanted to argue, wanted to list all the reasons why this couldn't work. But standing there in the sunlight streaming through the tall windows, with this impossible man looking at her like she hung the stars in the sky, all her protests seemed to crumble. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I know," he said, stepping closer. "Being scared doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. But I promise you this, as long as I draw breath, you will never have to be afraid of being hurt again. I will protect you, cherish you, love you with everything I am." "Marcus," she breathed. "Yes, I think I'm starting to believe you." His smile was radiant, and when he cupped her face in his hands and kissed her again, soft and sweet and full of promise, the golden thread between them blazed so bright it felt like coming home. 3 days had passed since their kiss in the garden, and Lyra was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, this impossible fairy tale might actually be real. Marcus had been nothing but patient and kind, showing her parts of the castle, sharing meals with her, treating her like she was something precious instead of the broken girl from the auction block. Which was why walking into the council chamber felt like stepping into a nest of vipers. "Your Majesty," Marcus had said that morning over breakfast, "I'd like you to meet my advisers today. They're eager to welcome their future queen." Future queen. The words still made her dizzy, but she'd agreed because she could see how important it was to him, because the golden thread between them hummed with his hope, and she was learning that his happiness was becoming as important to her as her own. But the moment she stepped into the room, she knew she'd made a terrible mistake. The council chamber was magnificent, with a long table of polished oak surrounded by high-backed chairs upholstered in royal blue. Portraits of previous kings lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge her from their gilded frames. And seated around that table were a dozen of the most intimidating people she'd ever seen. Lords and ladies in silk and velvet, their faces carefully neutral as they studied her. She was wearing one of the dresses that had appeared in her wardrobe, deep green silk with silver threading, but under their gazes she felt like she was back in her stepfather's borrowed servant dress. "Lords and ladies," Marcus said, his hand warm and steady on her lower back. "May I present Lady Lyra Ashwood?" The introductions passed in a blur of names she wouldn't remember and titles that made her head spin. They were all polite, perfectly correct, but she could hear the whispers underneath their formal greetings, the glances they thought she couldn't see, the questions they were too well bred to voice aloud. Where did she come from? What family was she connected to? What dowry did she bring? What political advantage did her marriage offer the kingdom? "Lady Ashwood," said Lord Pemberton, a man with silver hair and kind eyes. "What a pleasure to meet you. I understand you're from the southern provinces." "Yes, my lord," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "And your father's estate?" Heat flooded her cheeks. My father is dead, my lord. I was raised by my stepfather." "Ah, of course. And he is?" The questions kept coming, polite and relentless, each one designed to map her place in the complex web of noble society. And with each question, it became clearer that she had no place at all. No family connections, no political value, no dowry, no accomplishments that would justify her presence at this table. She was nobody, just like she'd always known. "Perhaps we should move on to other matters," Marcus said smoothly when the interrogation finally paused, but she could feel the tension radiating from him. The meeting continued, but Lyra barely heard any of it. She sat frozen in her chair, acutely aware of every sideways glance, every whispered conference between advisers. By the time Marcus dismissed the council, her hands were shaking in her lap. "That went well," he said as they walked back to her chambers, but his voice was carefully controlled. "No, it didn't." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "They think I'm completely unsuitable. They're right." "Lyra, I don't know anything about politics or diplomacy or running a kingdom. I can barely manage a conversation with nobility without embarrassing myself." Her voice was rising, all the old fears clawing their way to the surface. "What was I thinking? What were we both thinking?" "We were thinking that we're mates," Marcus said firmly. "That the bond between us is real and powerful and worth fighting for." "Is it? Is it really worth the instability it's going to cause? The doubt it's already causing?" She gestured helplessly toward the council chamber. "They don't respect me, Marcus. How can I possibly be a queen if the people I'm supposed to lead don't respect me?" "Respect is earned," he said, "and you'll earn it. I know you will." But his words felt hollow, and she could see in his eyes that he'd heard the whispers too, that he understood exactly how precarious her position was. She made it back to her chambers before the tears started falling. That evening, alone in the rose suite with only her doubts for company, Lyra found a piece of parchment that had been slipped under her door. Her name was written on the outside in an elegant script, and her heart leaped for a moment, thinking it might be a note from Marcus. But when she opened it, the words inside made her blood turn to ice. You think you can play at being queen, but you're nothing but a tavern wench who got lucky. Every day you remain here, you weaken the kingdom. Every day you stay, you put good people at risk. Leave now, while you still can, or face the consequences of your selfishness." There was no signature, but the threat was clear. And worse than the threat was the terrible certainty that whoever had written this wasn't entirely wrong. She was a risk to the kingdom. Her presence did create instability. And Marcus, wonderful, patient, noble Marcus, was paying the price for her inadequacy. Lyra sank onto the bed, the letter crumpling in her trembling hands. She'd known this was too good to be true. She'd known that girls like her didn't get fairy tale endings, but she'd let herself believe anyway, let herself hope for something that was always going to be impossible. The smart thing to do would be to leave. Tonight, before she caused any more damage. Before the noble's whispered doubts turned into open rebellion. Before she destroyed the man she was falling in love with. She was reaching for the travel bag that had been provided for her things when she heard voices in the corridor outside her room. Marcus's voice, tight with barely controlled anger, and another man's voice she didn't recognize. "Investigation is already underway," the stranger was saying. "We'll find out who's behind the attacks." "Attacks?" Marcus's voice was deadly calm, which somehow made it more terrifying than if he'd been shouting. 3 separate incidents in the past 2 days. Archers in the woods near the eastern border, poison in the water supply at the village of Millbrook, and a fire that took out half the grain stores in Westfield. No casualties yet, but it's clearly coordinated. Lyra's heart stopped. Attacks on the kingdom, villages threatened, and it was because of her. It had to be. The letter writer had warned her about consequences, about putting people at risk. This was her fault. Any demands? Any communication from the perpetrators? "Nothing yet, Your Majesty, but the pattern suggests someone is trying to destabilize your rule, create chaos that might force your hand politically. Or distract me from something more important," Marcus said grimly. "Double the patrols around the castle, and I want a full security detail on Lady Ashwood at all times." "Sir? If someone is trying to undermine my authority by targeting innocent people, they won't hesitate to target her directly. She's not to be alone for even a moment." Lyra pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling a sob. Guards to protect her from threats that existed because of her. More resources diverted, more people put at risk, all because she'd been selfish enough to stay when she should have run. The footsteps moved away down the corridor, but she could still hear Marcus's voice, giving more orders, making more arrangements to protect her from enemies she'd brought to his door. She couldn't do this any more. She couldn't be the weakness that brought down a good king and endangered innocent people. Moving quickly before she could lose her nerve, Lyra packed the few belongings she'd accumulated into the travel bag. She left the beautiful dresses in the wardrobe, they had never really belonged to her anyway, and put on the simple brown dress she'd worn under her stepfather's borrowed gown at the auction. It felt right, putting on her old clothes. It felt like admitting what she'd always known. She was nobody special, and nobody special didn't get to keep impossible dreams. She was almost finished packing when the door opened behind her. "Going somewhere?" Marcus's voice was carefully neutral, but when she turned around, the look in his golden eyes was anything but calm. He stood in the doorway, still dressed in his formal council clothes, and the sight of him made her heart crack clean in half. "I can't stay," she said, forcing the words past the lump in her throat. "I thought maybe I could, but I can't. This isn't where I belong." "Because of what happened in the council meeting? Because of what's happening to your kingdom?" The words exploded out of her. "The attacks, the instability, the way your advisors look at me like I'm a problem to be solved. I'm putting everyone at risk just by being here." His expression grew dangerous. "Who told you about the attacks?" "I overheard you talking in the corridor, and someone left me this." She held up the crumpled letter with shaking hands. Marcus crossed the room in 3 swift strides, taking the parchment from her and reading it with an expression that made something wild and powerful flicker in the air around them. When he looked up, his eyes were blazing with fury. "You think this letter is telling you the truth?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. "Isn't it?" she whispered. "I'm nobody, Marcus. I have no political value, no family connections, no skills that would help you rule. And now people are getting hurt because you're trying to make me into something I can never be." "The attacks have nothing to do with you," he said fiercely. "They're the work of someone who wants to destabilize the kingdom for their own gain. Someone who would be causing trouble whether you were here or not. But I make it worse. I make you vulnerable." "You make me stronger," he said, moving closer until he could cup her face in his hands. "You make me more than I ever was alone, and I will not let fear drive you away from me." "I'm not brave enough for this," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I'm not strong enough to be what you need." "You stood on an auction block with your head held high," he said softly. "You survived years of cruelty that would have broken most people. You opened your heart to love even when everything in your past told you it was dangerous. Don't tell me you're not brave enough." "The attacks will be dealt with. Whoever is behind them made one crucial mistake. They threatened something precious to me, and I will tear the kingdom apart to find them if I have to." The alpha power in his voice made her shiver, but it wasn't fear that ran through her. It was recognition. This was the man who had walked into an auction hall and claimed her with absolute certainty. This was the king who ruled the Northern Territories with wisdom and strength. And for reasons she still couldn't understand, he'd chosen her. "I don't want to run," she admitted in a broken whisper. "I want to stay. I want to believe this is real, but I'm so scared that I'll ruin everything you've worked for." "Then don't run," he said simply. "Stay and fight for us. Stay and let me show you that you're exactly what this kingdom needs, what I need." "Promise me something," she said, looking up into his golden eyes. "Anything. Promise me that if I truly become a danger to your people, you'll let me go. Don't sacrifice innocent lives for my sake." His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, but then he nodded slowly. "I promise. But Lyra, that day will never come. You're not a weakness. You're my greatest strength, and anyone who tries to convince you otherwise is going to learn exactly what happens when someone threatens my mate." The possessive growl in his voice sent heat spiraling through her, and the golden thread between them pulsed with fierce protective love. Maybe she wasn't brave enough or strong enough or worthy enough to be his queen, but maybe, just maybe, she could learn to be. The summons came at dawn. Lyra woke to urgent knocking on her door and a servant's breathless voice calling through the wood. "Lady Ashwood, His Majesty requests your immediate presence in the throne room. There's been a development." Her heart lurched. A development. That could mean anything, none of it good. She dressed quickly in the first gown she could reach. Deep burgundy silk that Marcus had told her brought out the gold flecks in her brown eyes, and made her way through corridors that buzzed with unusual activity. Guards stood at attention every few feet, their hands resting on sword hilts. Servants moved with quick, nervous steps, whispering to each other in voices too low to understand. Something was happening, something that had the entire castle on edge. The throne room doors stood open, and Lyra could hear voices from within, Marcus's calm, authoritative tone, and another voice she didn't recognize. As she approached, 2 guards fell into step behind her, and she realized with a chill that Marcus had kept his promise about protection. She hadn't been alone for a moment since their confrontation the night before, but when she stepped into the throne room, she understood that protection might not be enough. Marcus sat on his throne, a masterpiece of carved wood and precious metals that seemed to amplify his natural authority. He wore his formal crown, a circlet of silver set with sapphires that caught the morning light streaming through the tall windows. Every inch of him radiated royal power, from his straight shoulders to the way his golden eyes surveyed the room with calculating intelligence. And standing before that throne, flanked by guards but still radiating arrogance, was a man who made Lyra's skin crawl. Lord Blackwood was exactly the kind of noble she'd feared meeting in the council chamber. Tall and lean, with silver-streaked hair and cold blue eyes that missed nothing. His clothes were expensive but understated, the kind of wealth that didn't need to announce itself, but it was the way he looked at her, like she was an insect he'd found in his soup, that made her want to run. "Ah, Lady Ashwood," he said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "How convenient. I was just discussing your situation with His Majesty." "Lord Blackwood," Marcus said, his voice carrying a warning that would have made wise men step back. "I believe we were finished with our discussion." "On the contrary, Your Majesty, I think we're just getting started." Blackwood reached into his coat and withdrew a rolled parchment tied with an official-looking seal. "You see, I've discovered something quite interesting about your charming guest." The golden thread in Lyra's chest went cold. Whatever was in that document, it wasn't going to be good. "It seems," Blackwood continued, unrolling the parchment with theatrical flair, "that Lady Ashwood's stepfather didn't just sell her to pay his gambling debts. According to these records, he sold her to me specifically. I am, legally speaking, her guardian and benefactor, which means this entire arrangement is invalid." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow. She felt the blood drain from her face, her knees threatening to give out. It couldn't be true. Her stepfather had sold her to the highest bidder, not to any specific person. But as Blackwood held up the document, she could see official seals, signatures, legal language that looked terrifyingly real. "Furthermore," Blackwood said, clearly enjoying the shocked silence his revelation had created, "I have reason to believe that Lady Ashwood has been, shall we say, less than truthful about her circumstances. The simple tavern keeper's stepdaughter story is quite touching, but the reality is somewhat different." Marcus rose from his throne, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Careful, Blackwood, you're walking on very thin ice." "Am I? Because according to my sources, dear Lyra here was involved in some rather unsavoury activities before her stepfather's debts came due. Theft, mostly. Small things at first. Coins from customers, jewellery from the other serving girls. But then it escalated." "That's not true," Lyra whispered, but her voice was so quiet she wasn't sure anyone heard her. "No?" Blackwood's smile was sharp as a blade. "Then perhaps you can explain how a simple serving girl managed to accumulate enough debt to require selling herself at auction. Because those weren't her stepfather's debts, Your Majesty. They were hers." The lie was so smoothly told, so perfectly crafted, that for a moment even Lyra wondered if it might be true. But then she remembered the bruises, the hunger, the way her stepfather had looked at her like she was worth less than the mud on his boots. "You're lying," she said, louder this time. "Am I? These documents say otherwise. Official complaints filed with the local magistrate, witness statements, evidence of a pattern of behaviour that suggests Lady Ashwood is not the innocent victim she's pretending to be." Marcus stepped down from the throne, and Lyra could feel the alpha power rolling off him in waves. "Even if your fabricated documents were real, which they're not, it wouldn't matter. Lyra is under my protection now." "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Your Majesty." Blackwood's smile widened. "You see, I didn't just purchase her debts. I purchased her. All legal rights, all obligations, all responsibilities. She belongs to me now, and I'm here to collect my property." The word property hit the room like a thunderclap. Several of the nobles who had gathered to witness this confrontation gasped audibly, and Lyra felt something inside her chest shatter. Property. After everything, after Marcus's gentle words and patient care, after beginning to believe she might actually be worth something, she was still nothing more than property to be bought and sold. "That contract," Marcus said, his voice deadly quiet, "is not worth the parchment it's written on. I'm afraid the law disagrees with you, Your Majesty, and I'm prepared to take this matter to the High Court if necessary, unless, of course, you're willing to be reasonable." "What do you want, Blackwood?" Simple. Return my property to me, and I'll forget this entire embarrassing episode ever happened. Continue to harbour a known thief and fraud, and I'll make sure the entire kingdom knows exactly what kind of woman their future queen really is. The threat hung in the air like poison. Lyra could see the calculation in Blackwood's eyes, the certainty that he held all the cards. He'd crafted his lies perfectly, backed them up with false documents, and cornered them in the most public way possible. And the worst part was that part of her wanted to believe him. Part of her had always known this was too good to be true, that someone like her could never really belong in this world. But then Marcus spoke, and his words cut through her despair like a sword through silk. No. The single word rang through the throne room with absolute finality. Blackwood blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no." Marcus moved to stand beside Lyra, his presence warm and solid and utterly immovable. "You want to know what I think of your documents, Blackwood? Of your lies and your threats and your pathetic attempt to extort my mate?" "Your Majesty, I hardly think—" "I think," Marcus continued, his voice rising with each word, "that you are a coward and a fool who has just made the greatest mistake of his worthless life." The alpha power in the room intensified, making the air itself feel heavy and charged. Lyra could see some of the weaker-willed nobles actually take steps backward, their instincts screaming at them to submit to the dominant predator in their midst. "You want to claim ownership of Lyra Ashwood?" Marcus's eyes blazed with golden fire. "Then you'll have to go through me, and I promise you, Blackwood, that's not a fight you want to have." "She's a thief and a liar," Blackwood said, but his voice had lost some of its confidence. "The kingdom deserves better than—" "The kingdom deserves exactly what it's getting," Marcus cut him off. "A queen who understands hardship. A queen who knows what it means to struggle, to fight for survival, to endure cruelty and still choose kindness. A queen who will rule with both wisdom and compassion because she's lived in both darkness and light." He turned to face the assembled nobles, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast room. "You want to know who Lyra Ashwood really is? She's a woman who survived years of abuse and neglect, who gave scraps to hungry animals when she barely had enough food for herself, who stood on an auction block with her head held high because she refused to be broken by circumstances beyond her control." The golden thread between them was blazing now, singing with such intensity that Lyra felt like her entire chest was on fire, but it wasn't painful. It was glorious, overwhelming, like being filled with liquid sunlight. "More than that," Marcus continued, his gaze finding hers across the room. "She's my mate, my chosen queen, the other half of my soul, and anyone who thinks they can take her from me is about to learn exactly why I've held this throne unchallenged for 15 years. "The law—" Blackwood began desperately. "The law recognises my right as Alpha King to claim my mate above all other considerations," Marcus said, his smile sharp and dangerous. "It also recognises my right to strip titles and lands from anyone who threatens the crown. Would you like me to exercise that right, Blackwood?" The threat was clear, and Blackwood's face went pale. But Lyra could see the calculation still working behind his eyes, the desperate search for another angle of attack. "Even if you can ignore the legal challenges," he said, "what about the political ones? She brings no alliances, no dowry, no advantage to the kingdom. The other noble houses will never—" "Will never what?" Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. "Question my judgment? Challenge my authority? Because if that's what you're suggesting, Blackwood, then perhaps it's time we settled the matter once and for all." "Marcus," Lyra whispered, finally finding her voice, "you don't have to—" "Yes, I do," he said, turning to look at her with such fierce love that it took her breath away. "I have to stand up for us, for what we have, for what we're going to build together." He walked back to his throne, but instead of sitting, he reached for something that had been resting against the armrest. A sword, beautiful and deadly, with a blade that seemed to capture and hold the light. "Lord Blackwood," Marcus said formally, "I challenge you to single combat for the right to determine Lady Ashwood's fate. Do you accept?" The room went dead silent. Single combat was an ancient right, rarely invoked, but absolutely binding under kingdom law. If Blackwood accepted and lost, his claims would be void forever. If he refused, he would be branded a coward and exiled. Blackwood's face cycled through several shades of pale before settling on a sickly green. "Your Majesty, surely we can resolve this through more civilized means." "You questioned my mate's honour," Marcus said quietly. "You called her a thief and a liar in my own throne room. You threatened to tear down everything I've built for the sake of your own petty ambitions. There is no more civilized response to that than letting you answer for your words with steel." That is—" Blackwood looked around the room desperately, searching for support that clearly wasn't coming. The other nobles watched with fascination, but none stepped forward to defend him. "I withdraw my claims," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too late," Marcus said with quiet satisfaction. "You made your accusations public. Now you answer for them publicly, or you leave this kingdom forever and never return." Blackwood's shoulders sagged in defeat. Without another word he turned and walked toward the doors, his false documents scattered and forgotten on the floor behind him. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Lord Blackwood," he called out, and the man froze in the doorway. "If I ever hear that you've spoken ill of my queen again, if you so much as whisper her name in anything less than respectful tones, I will hunt you down personally. Are we understood?" "Yes, Your Majesty," Blackwood said without turning around. "Perfectly understood." Then he was gone, and the throne room erupted in whispered conversations and nervous laughter. But Lyra only had eyes for Marcus as he set down his sword and walked toward her with purpose written in every line of his body. "Lyra Ashwood," he said when he reached her, his voice carrying clearly through the vast room. "Will you do me the honour of becoming my wife and queen?" She stared up at him, this impossible man who had just risked everything to defend her honour, who had faced down false accusations and political threats and emerged victorious, who was now proposing to her in front of his entire court as if she truly were worthy of such devotion. "Yes," she whispered, and then louder, "Yes!" His smile was brilliant as he took her hands in his and raised them to his lips. "Then, by the authority vested in me, as Alpha King of the Northern Territories, I claim you as my mate and future queen. Let any who would challenge this union step forward now, or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed was absolute and beautiful, and when Marcus kissed her there in front of his entire court, the golden thread between them blazed so bright that Lyra was certain the whole world could see it. 6 months later, Lyra stood in front of a mirror that reflected a woman she barely recognized. The girl who had once stood on an auction block in borrowed clothes was gone, replaced by someone who wore a crown of silver and sapphires as if she'd been born to it. The wedding gown that surrounded her was a masterpiece of silk and lace, with pearls sewn into intricate patterns that caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows of her chambers. But it wasn't the finery that had transformed her. It was the confidence in her eyes, the way she held her shoulders, the quiet strength that radiated from her very being. "You look beautiful, Your Majesty," said Elena, the lady's maid who had become something closer to a friend over the past months. "His Majesty is going to be speechless when he sees you." Lyra smiled, touching the golden pendant at her throat, a wedding gift from Marcus that contained a piece of amber with a preserved flower inside. He'd told her it represented their love, something beautiful captured forever, protected and eternal. "Is everything ready?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of preparation, not just for the wedding, but for her new life as queen. Marcus had kept his promise about teaching her everything she needed to know, but more than that, he'd shown her how to trust in her own instincts and judgment. "The cathedral is packed, Your Majesty. Representatives from every kingdom in the known world have come to witness your marriage, and the people—" Elena's smile was radiant. "The people are absolutely enchanted with you." It was true, though it still sometimes surprised Lyra to remember. The common folk had embraced their future queen with an enthusiasm that had caught even Marcus off guard. Perhaps it was because she understood their struggles in a way no noble-born queen could have. Perhaps it was because her first royal decree had been to establish kitchens for the hungry in every major city. Or perhaps it was simply because love like theirs was impossible to hide, and people recognized something genuine when they saw it. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in." She expected to see Marcus. He'd developed a habit of finding excuses to visit her throughout the day, stealing kisses and reminding her how much he loved her. But instead, a familiar figure stepped through the doorway, and Lyra's breath caught in her throat. "Mira?" Her sister stood there looking uncertain and overwhelmed, dressed in a gown of soft blue that complemented her dark hair. It had been 7 years since they'd seen each other, 7 years since their stepfather had sold Mira to a merchant family 3 kingdoms away. But Marcus had found her, just as he'd promised, and brought her home for the wedding. "Hello, Lyra," Mira said softly. You look like a queen." "I look like me," Lyra said, and realized it was true. For the first time in her life, she felt like herself, not the worthless girl her stepfather had created, not the broken victim she'd believed herself to be, but the woman she'd always been underneath it all. The sisters embraced, years of separation melting away in an instant. "I'm so proud of you," Mira whispered against her ear. "When I heard what happened, I could hardly believe it. Our Lyra married to the Alpha King." "It doesn't feel real sometimes," Lyra admitted. "But then I see him look at me, and I know that somehow this impossible thing is actually my life now." "He loves you," Mira said with certainty. "Anyone with eyes can see that. The way he talks about you, the way his whole face changes when someone mentions your name, it's like watching someone discuss the sun." Another knock interrupted them, this one more formal. "Your Majesty," came a voice through the door. "It's time." Lyra's heart fluttered with nerves and excitement. After months of planning, after a lifetime of never believing she could deserve this kind of happiness, the moment had finally arrived. The cathedral was indeed packed, just as Elena had said. Every seat was filled with nobility from across the continent, their fine clothes creating a sea of silk and velvet. But as Lyra walked down the aisle on Mira's arm, the sister she'd never expected to see again serving as her escort, in place of the family that had never truly loved her, she only had eyes for the man waiting at the altar. Marcus stood there in formal dress uniform, deep blue with silver trim that made his golden eyes seem to glow. He was surrounded by his groomsmen, by the priest who would perform the ceremony, by all the pomp and circumstance befitting a royal wedding. But when his gaze found hers across the crowded cathedral, everything else faded away. The golden thread between them sang with such intensity that she wondered if the entire congregation could hear it. Love, joy, completion, promise, it was all there in that invisible bond that connected their hearts. When she reached the altar, Marcus stepped forward to take her hand, and the simple touch sent warmth spiraling through her entire being. "You're beautiful," he murmured, for her ears alone. "You're perfect. You're everything I never dared to dream I could have." "So are you," she whispered back, and meant it with every fibre of her being. The ceremony passed in a blur of ancient words and sacred promises. Lyra heard herself speaking the vows they'd written together, promises of love and trust and partnership that felt too huge and wonderful to be real. She heard Marcus's voice, steady and sure, as he pledged his heart and his kingdom to her protection. And then the priest was pronouncing them husband and wife, king and queen, and Marcus was kissing her as the cathedral erupted in celebration around them. "My queen," he said against her lips, and the words sent shivers of happiness through her. "My king," she replied, and finally understood that she meant it completely. The reception was a feast that would be talked about for years. Tables groaned under the weight of delicacies from every corner of the kingdom. Musicians filled the air with melodies that made even the most dignified nobles want to dance, and toasts were offered that praised not just the royal couple, but the hope they represented for the future. Lyra found herself moving through it all with a grace she'd never known she possessed, accepting congratulations from foreign ambassadors, discussing trade agreements with merchant princes, laughing with the common folk who had been invited to join the celebration. This was her life now, not just Marcus's wife, but a true partner in ruling the kingdom. "You're a natural," Marcus said, when they finally had a moment alone together, stealing away to a quiet balcony overlooking the gardens where they'd shared their first real conversation. "I had a good teacher," she said, leaning into his warmth, "and I finally understand something you tried to tell me months ago." "What's that?" "Being queen isn't about being perfect or having all the right answers. It's about caring enough to keep trying, to keep learning, to keep fighting for the people you're responsible for." She looked up at him, this incredible man who had seen something worth saving in a broken girl on an auction block. "I can do that. I want to do that." "You're going to be amazing," he said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You already are amazing. The kingdom is lucky to have you." "We're lucky to have each other," she corrected. "I never thought I'd be able to say that and mean it, but here we are." "Here we are," he agreed, and the golden thread between them pulsed with contentment and joy, and the promise of all the years stretching ahead of them. Later that night, in the privacy of their chambers, Marcus presented her with one final wedding gift, a leather-bound journal with her initials embossed on the cover. "What's this for?" she asked, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "For your thoughts, your ideas, your dreams," he said. "I know you lost your books when you were young, but I thought maybe it was time for you to start writing your own stories." Tears pricked at her eyes as she opened the journal to find the first page already inscribed in Marcus's elegant handwriting. "For my queen, who taught me that the best love stories are the ones that seemed impossible until they became inevitable." "Marcus," she breathed. "I love you, Lyra Thornfield," he said, using her married name for the first time. "I love your courage and your kindness and your stubborn refusal to give up even when everything seemed hopeless. I love the way you see the best in people, the way you fight for those who can't fight for themselves, the way you make me want to be better than I ever thought I could be." "I love you too," she said, setting the journal aside so she could frame his face with her hands. "I love your patience and your strength and the way you never stopped believing I was worth saving. I love that you waited for me, that you found me, that you chose me over everything else you could have had." When he kissed her then, it was with all the passion and tenderness and promise of their future together. The golden thread between them blazed with such intensity that Lyra felt like she might actually be glowing, transformed by love from the inside out. And as they held each other in the flickering candlelight of their chambers, surrounded by the warmth and safety she'd never thought she'd have, Lyra finally understood what Marcus had been trying to tell her all along. She wasn't nothing. She had never been nothing. She was a woman who had survived impossible odds and learned to love anyway. She was a queen who would rule with both wisdom and compassion because she understood what it meant to suffer and what it meant to hope. She was exactly who she was supposed to be. The girl who had stood on that auction block 6 months ago could never have imagined this moment, wrapped in the arms of the man who loved her, wearing a crown that felt like it had always belonged to her, looking forward to a future bright with possibility. But that girl had been wrong about so many things. She'd been wrong about her own worth, wrong about what she deserved, wrong about the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. She thought her story was ending that night in the auction hall. Instead, it had only just begun.